They picked the baby. A small hand fogs the glass. Frost blooms where fingertips press, white like the lace on the little dress the baby is wearing in the family picture on the mantel. On the photo, they all smile. Mother with her head tilted proud, father holding the baby like a warm coin. The baby in a frilly outfit, cheeks full and glossy. In the corner of the frame, 5-year-old Shen Xinghe leans forward, her braid loose, watching. You can see she was there. You can see she wanted to be seen. They picked the baby. They made room for Zhenzhen in every ordinary thing a family gives a child. Bed, blanket, second helpings, first kisses. Everything else was margin. Xinghe knows how margins feel. Her bed is narrower than the mattress upstairs, shoved into the corner of a small room that smells of textbook paper and the faint sweetness of old candy. On the shelf above her bed sit the remains of an afternoon science project, a cardboard castle with a few turrets chewed at one edge. Beside it, in a dented tin lunchbox, the doll she used to hold close at night, doll hair matted where it was clutched so tight night after night, smiles with one glass eye missing. The other eye stares out at the ceiling where a princess sticker peels from humidity. Someone once bought a princess bedspread for Zhenzhen, and it glows in memory like a promise. I wanted that dress. I wanted to be told I was pretty. I wanted a slice of the cake with the shiny sugar heart. Her small wants look like noise. They read like childish greed if she says them aloud. So she keeps them like small stones in her pockets, carrying them in silence. Morning is a study in comparisons. The baby wakes to music and soft hands. Zhenzhen's crib sits under a canopy of pale fabric. A string of tiny lights makes it look like a throne. The mother, Shu Ting, hums while she lifts the baby, swaddling her, checking the thermometer like a ritual. The father, Shen Xinghe, moves slower, but the way his face softens when Zhenzhen cries is a kind of confession. They scoff at crumbs on her shirts. They smooth the ruffles of the baby's dress as if those folds must be kept immaculate to prove she is loved. Xinghe jumps out from the corner of those mornings, making a route past the kitchen where a bowl is set out half full of milk, a plate with one pancake that is just enough for her. Sometimes she is given a pillow with a cartoon cat. Other times she finds herself shuffled into a second thought routine. Wait, not now. Later, sweetie. Be gentle with your sister. Do the parents mean it to be a value judgment? Maybe not. But values are lived in small choices. The baby gets an extra blanket. The baby gets a second serving of cake. The baby gets a princess bed when the mismatch of tongues and times makes room for one more indulgence. They explain it away to neighbors with soft voices. She's little, Grandma Zhang will say, folding her hands at the table so they look like quiet petitioners. Babies need more. The words pass like moths in the room, light, fluttering, and they settle on the mother's shoulders as justification. The grandmother's eyes, though, always carry an edge when they fall on Xinghe. A look that measures children against an imagined ideal. The look is a kind of scale that never balances. Xinghe watches the edge of things. She learns the rhythms of being half-chosen. She learns to make herself small. She learns to behave like the background in her own home. On days when the sun flares, the family sometimes goes to the park. The baby is swaddled in a red blanket and admired by strangers who pat her cheek as if she were made of something rare. Someone takes a photograph, father holding the baby, mother at his side, and Xinghe stands at the edge and smiles for the camera in a practiced way. Her smile is a coin flipped and caught. It is the face she wears to prove she belongs. After the picture, the mother fusses over the baby's hair, while the father opens a small paper bag with 2 steamed buns. Zhenzhen gets the sweeter one. Xinghe takes the other and pretends it tastes just as good. When she is 5, good taste is a belief she practices like prayer. She cares for the baby in ways no one notices. Once Zhenzhen had a fever and couldn't sleep. She tossed and cried, her forehead hot as a stone. Xinghe remembers a night that smelled of medicine and warm tea where the baby's cries were sharp and small in the room. The air conditioner in the hallway hummed like a giant in a lullaby. Xinghe put her hand on the baby's forehead and felt the heat as if holding a coal spit. She went to the living room and turned the dial a little lower because the room felt like a blanket. Lower, lower, so the baby could cool down. She imagined blowing a soft wind across the baby's face. She imagined the fever fading like mist. That night, the mother, distracted and raw from worry, saw the turned dial and saw intention instead of kindness. "Why did you touch the air?" she asked with a voice that sounded like glass. The father frowned at the thermostat as if it had a secret message written in it. Fingers pointed without the ceremony of a trial. A simple act, turning the air down to give the baby relief, became a proof of mischief. Xinghe wanted to make her cold. Grandma Zhang said quietly, more to the room than to anyone. Children can be cruel when they want attention. Children can be cruel. The phrase went on, flattened by repetition until it looked like a fact. Parents make a story when they are afraid. Stories protect them from random chance. Stories give a face to blame. Younger sisters are easier to tell stories about. They are small narratives of need. They are simple, tidy causes. The older child becomes a character in someone else's script, not an author. Once, at Xinghe's birthday, the house hung balloons and a small cake with a single candle for her. It was the truth. There was a day when the parents tried. But the mother's hand lingered on the baby's bib while the candle was lit, making sure Zhenzhen's face was captured in the photograph. The mother bought a new dress for the baby later that afternoon and made a ceremony of smoothing the fabric. For months afterward, the dress was folded into a drawer with the scent of new cloth like an unspent blessing. When the doll's head came off, it was not because of time. The mother held the plastic head in her palm and said, "You must learn. You must know." She snapped the part cleanly like a lesson. It was not physical cruelty as much as ritual, an attempt to carve obedience from the clay of a child. The father watched. He looked between the broken doll and his daughter, as if trying to measure whether love could be hammered into shape. Xinghe picked up the doll head and pressed the hollow where the screw had been against her lips, wanting to taste the past. She did not cry. She put the pieces in her pocket and kept going to school as if this were all a normal day. Children learn to reshelve pain next to crayons and homework assignments. They become very good at pretending that the shelf is sturdy. Neighbors whispered about the house. Some said the mother was overworked, the father distracted by overtime at work. Others said families are complicated, and you cannot know the inside by looking at the outside. People always think the worst, one neighbor murmured, rocking a shopping bag against her knees. But children, they're complicated. They want attention. Aunt Tiantian watched more than she spoke. She lived 2 doors down, and could see into the living room through a window that had once been her grandmother's. She saw the way the mother's eyes softened with Zhenzhen and hardened with Xinghe. She saw the father's hands tremble when he was asked to choose which child to bring to a doctor's visit. On a day when the baby's cheeks went bright and feverish, Aunt Tiantian came bearing ginger tea and left a hand on Xinghe's shoulder for a second longer than politics required. "Young ones are curious," she said once, kneading the dough in the kitchen as if it were a thinking task. "Curiosity is not malice. Watch them, sure, don't tell yourself stories. But stories are easy. They are lighter to carry than doubt." For months, the family lived in this slow tilt. Favoritism was 1,000 tiny decisions made as if by accident. Extra rice for Zhenzhen, the best seat for Zhenzhen, the mother tucking the baby in the big bed and telling the older child to lie quietly in the small bed. For Xinghe, favoritism is not always absence of affection. Sometimes it is a kind of love that says, "Be careful not to take up too much room." That kind of love is a corridor without windows. Younger children in the household get more than they need. They get explanations for everything. They get excuses. The older child gets reasons why things cannot go differently. Sometimes the father tried to balance it. He would pick up Xinghe's drawings from the floor and tape them on the refrigerator door, the family's public gallery of simple triumphs. Once he asked her about school, about her friends, about the picture she'd drawn of trees that looked like hands. For a moment, he seemed to see her as the center of his day. Then someone called him from work, and the call took the shape of urgency. His face folded back into familiar lines when he rushed off. The attempt at attention was brief and fragile, like fruit left half-peeled on a counter. If anyone else in the community had a spare hand to give, They gave it to the baby. The baby sucked thumb more often in public. She cooed and smiled in ways that demanded care. Many adults, when confronted with a small bundle, forget the older hands that once wished for the same. They mistake the baby's needs for the family's entire identity. After the first act of brokenness, after the doll and the turned dial and the whispered accusatory phrases, a day came when the contradiction between the mother's fear and the child's intention snapped into something dangerously rigid. It was late afternoon and the air had an exhausted heat, like dishes that had been washed and left to dry in the sun. The baby was feverish again. Sheets smelled of steaming clothes. Medicine tasted like metal. The mother paced, prayers folding into a single repeated phrase. The father rubbed his hands on his jeans until they went red, as if friction could dissolve worry. The grandmother hovered, offering aphorisms. "Young ones need discipline," she said. "We must show them their place." "You teach them with kindness," said Aunt Tiantian when she came in at dusk. She held her cup of tea and watched the baby do a small, exhausted whimper. "Teach them to love with actions, not with fear." But fear is contagious. The house filled with it like water filling a room. The mother's voice, thin with exhaustion, found an edge. "Xinghe," she said at last, the name a bell. "You did this." Xinghe closed the door between herself and the accusation, with the same speed she used to close her lunchbox. She felt the scalding heat of the mother's eyes as if they had a temperature. She had meant only to help. She had only lowered the air because the baby was too hot. She had placed her hand against the other child's forehead like a ritual, like a soft cooling. "I was trying to help," she said. Her voice had the bluntness of 5-year-old honesty. She was burning. I wanted her to stop. The mother's face was a map of grief and something like suspicion. The father's jaw set. The grandmother retold stories in her head, stories of children who misbehave and then learn to do better. "You must learn," the mother said finally, and this time the words were not about the doll. It was broader, a principle to realign behavior with the house's sense of order. You have to know what happens when you do things like that. What the mother had in mind was not a lesson you could outline in neat terms. It was the kind of punishment people in their family used when they wanted an action to be remembered. "Stay there," the mother said, pointing to the hallway where the big white appliance hummed like another heartbeat in the room. Xinghe looked at the refrigerator. It was tall and ordinary, chrome and slightly dented. Inside it was cold and ordered, a place where food waited for hands, and the night kept its food. Children sometimes hide in odd places. Adults sometimes tell them they are going into rooms to think. This was not a thinking place. "I'll come back," the mother said, voice small and brittle as a match. "You'll understand later. This is for your good." Xinghe thought oddly of the doll head in her pocket. She held the broken thing and felt how small it was. She imagined being put back together like a game. "Okay," she said, because obedience is the shape that makes rooms calm. She went to the refrigerator and opened it. The inside smelled of metal and apple, of cold and cleaning fluid. Breath fogged the glass of the crisper drawer. She climbed in like a cat that slipped into a cardboard box, knees folding against the cool plastic. It felt like stepping into a secret. For a moment she expected the door to open again, to be scooped up and told it had been a joke. A tiny lesson with a soft ending. She waited. The hum hummed. The light inside the fridge swallowed her small shapes in white plastic and shadow. She could hear the house breathe. Her own breath sounded too big for the space. The door closed. There was a click, but not like the click of a toy. It was the click of something that settles. The mother's footsteps walked away. Voices drifted and then grew distant. The hum of the appliances held its ground, like a watchman on duty. The world shrank to the small space of the refrigerator, to the white shelves, to the smell of cold that felt alive. I thought it would be quick. I thought they would open it and laugh. I thought they would apologize and take me out and let me play with the baby again. The first minutes are a kind of lesson about time. In a room with a clock outside and a light inside, you stop keeping ordinary time. You measure instead by the way the light grows dimmer as evening comes, by the soft press of that hum in your ears. Her hands moved over the plastic. She pressed the glass of a milk bottle and felt condensation trellis beneath her fingers. She tried to make herself smaller for a reason that felt like a self-defense practice. Make less room, be less trouble, be tolerated. Outside, the house continued its rhythm. The mother fussed over towels and called for medicine and counted the breaths of the baby like someone trying to count the stars. The father called the hospital's emergency number and paced. The grandmother tutted about morals and stories. Conversations happened in hurried cadences, as if spoken words could speed away consequence. When the front door opened again in that first hour, Xinghe heard it like a distant drum. Steps passed near the kitchen. Voices. Laughter that she wanted to imagine as a promise. She imagined being found, being taken out, being told she was brave, being hugged, having the doll head glued back on with a flourish. But the house had arranged its compassion in columns. The windows of the day had been sold out to the baby. The bruises of that economy were not always visible at first. Night fell. The fridge light grew less bright. The hum took on a grimmer tone. Hunger is a dull, insistent thing in a small child's chest. So is cold. She wrapped her arms around herself and felt the thinness of the shirt against her ribs. Through the thin wall, she could hear the muffled sound of the television and a commercial pitch that felt like normalcy. She stood on the edge of her belief that this was only a mistake. She told herself stories to die on, imagined scenarios where someone opened the door and said, "It was only a joke." She rehearsed the words she would say to a calm mother, "I was only trying to help." The first night in the fridge is long because children are small, and their imaginations only half trust adult correction. She felt like an animal that had been told to hide. She pressed the doll head to her chest and whispered apologies into the plastic. Morning came with a different light. It was not the warm, golden morning of the picture frames. It was a white light that made the inside of the fridge look like a hospital room in a storybook. Her breath came out in little clouds that puffed and then vanished. Her hands were colder than they had been before. She knocked on the plastic. The sound was a dull, small thing. She called softly, "Mom?" But the name was swallowed by the hum. Somewhere a bicycle bell tinked. A neighbor opened a window and drifted the smell of cooking outward. The family had routines that encircled the refrigerator like an orbit. When the mother walked past the kitchen, she glanced at the animal magnet on the door and kept going. She had picked the baby and packed the day with errands that meant filling the baby's needs. An appointment, a medicine, a trip that would feel like giving air to lungs. A day became something that could be described in lists: meals, errands, visits. It did not include one small body in the refrigerator until the absence became unignorable. A parent's worry has its own architecture. First you check the usual places, then the not-so-usual. Then you construct scenarios that make sense. The refrigerator, which is for food, is not the place you think a child would hide in. That is why it is dangerous. It is small, white, ordinary. On the second morning, the baby's fever did not break. The father's face looked older. The mother's apologies turned into a careful, practiced anxiety. "We must do everything right," she told the father, the words being said into the same empty space you fill when you don't know how to ask for forgiveness. The day opened and closed like a book with pages missing. The neighbors began to notice with the kind of attention that stacks like dominoes. "Did you see the way they left the house?" someone asked in the courtyard. "They went out quickly, took the baby." Stories grew arms. "Perhaps she ran away," one whispered, making sense of difficulty with a tidy narrative. "Maybe she left because she was upset," said another, whose own guilt made them eager to accept an easier truth. When the family left for an outing, an urgent trip, a place they said was necessary for the baby's recovery, the house seemed emptier than before. They carried with them the suffocating certainty that the older child had misbehaved. They packed clothes and a change of diapers, a bag of medicine, and a blanket for the baby. They put on their faces for the world, concerned parents delivering suffering to the right institution, the hospital. Inside the fridge, the light flickered. Time stretched. The hum deepened into a low bass you can feel in your teeth. The cold crept in a way that made thinking slower. It made memories loom larger. She thought of the princess spread on the baby's bed and how its frills shimmered like a mirror she could not reach. She thought of the packet of crackers she had eaten the day before in a small celebratory rebellion. She thought of the cake icing that slid down the baby's chin, and how everyone had made a fuss. "I was trying to help," she said to the air and to the doll head in her pocket. The words were thin, but she believed them like a child believes in miraculous solutions. Down the street, Aunt Tiantian walked past the house and paused at the gate. She had come earlier that week with Ginger and a laundry basket, and had left a small bag of things in the little side yard. Her eyes glanced at the house, at the window where she'd glimpsed the mother's face bowed and the father running his palms across his forehead. She wanted to knock, wanted to say something quiet, but she took the path to the market instead, because the mother seemed to be managing. When a neighbor's porter found a shoe tucked oddly under the hedge, and mention of a missing child spread like a cold wind through the courtyard, someone bolted across a path toward the house. They knocked and then the answers came in parts. It became clear, like a slow peel, that someone was not where they should be. "Have you checked everywhere?" people asked. But not every place is thought of when panic runs in the house. Some places are invisible because adults cannot imagine cruelty in the spaces they use for love. The refrigerator is one of those places. It is full of things you put trust into: milk, food, medicine. It is the quiet keeper of a family's ordinary needs. To imagine a child inside it is to rearrange the rules you live by. The community breathed in shorts of disbelief, and then exhaled suspicion. The mother's voice frayed. The father's legs trembled. The grandmother muttered old proverbs. The story that had been arranged to protect the baby began to crack at its edges. But in the house, the hum of the refrigerator was still steady. The little girl inside, with a head that had once been whole and now fit into a pocket like a secret, wrapped her arms around herself and listened. She listened for the mother's footsteps. She listened for the sound of being forgiven. She listened for a hand that would lift the door and lift her out. The door stayed shut. The sun slipped further. Shadows moved across the kitchen tiles like slow, indifferent waves. The doll head warmed in her pocket from the small heat of her body. She counted time by the changing cold. Outside, people began to ask questions they had been too polite to voice before. Inside, a child kept learning how deep silence could get. The hum became a second heartbeat. And then, a sound as ordinary as a key turning in a lock echoed not in the kitchen, but in the heart of someone who had been listening for too long. The sound belonged to someone not yet known well enough. The neighbor watching. A voice that would bend the story in a different direction. But that is a sound that belongs to another day. For now, in the small white room, the child breathes and waits. The door is closed like an unspoken choice. The house keeps its regular noise while one small life holds its breath and tries to make a story that will make sense of what has been done. They chose the baby. They left a child where cold could reach her and intended to teach a lesson that one child would remember. The lesson they wanted was obedience. The lesson they gave was danger. She presses the doll to her mouth again. "I am here," she thinks, as if that is a plea and a proof. "I am here. She will not be invisible forever." The thought is at once fragile and iron-strong, like a promise whispered into the hum. At the gate, Aunt Tiantian stands thinking about calling back, about knocking, about making a fuss. Her hands twist around the strap of her basket. She considers the mother's eyes the last time she saw them, hard and careful. The world organizes itself into decisions. Sometimes the smallest decision is the one that changes what the world believes about you. The house breathes the same breath, one rhythm. Inside, the fridge light grows dim as the afternoon tilts. Outside, a child who had been given the smaller bed lays herself flat on the floor of her own mind and hopes for the soft sound of a door opening. At the gate, Aunt Tiantian's fingers loosen on the basket strap until the weave rubs a bright circle into her palm. She thinks of the mother's face the last time she visited. Tight, uneven, like paper folded wrong. She thinks of the way the father had lifted the baby into his arms and held her, as if the world might break if he let go. She tells herself one more thing, a small test. Maybe she is overreacting. Maybe this is a moment of fear, and it will pass. She walks up the path anyway, slower than usual, until the house is close and the hum of the refrigerator reaches her ears like an accusation. At the kitchen window she pauses. The curtains flap and a sliver of light shows a cupboard ajar, a towel on the floor. She knocks softly, then louder. A voice answers from inside, thin, controlled. "We're fine," the mother calls without looking. "Everything's under control." Aunt Tiantian knows the tone. She remembers nights when she took her own children to the clinic, when fear made adults sharper and quieter and quick to dismiss unwelcome questions. She does not look for permission to do what she thinks must be done. She goes to the kitchen door and opens it on the hinge of the neighbor's habit, not the mother's. The refrigerator stands where it always has, chrome dulled by years of magnets and grocery lists. Yet when she opens it, the cold breath that hits her is different, thin and quick, like someone exhaling in a small, clenched space. She does not narrate the act to herself. She moves. There is a milk bottle with condensation, a crate of apples, a small square of something wrapped in tin foil, and then a small shiver, a human-shaped bundle tucked behind a tray. She sees a braid and a tiny hand pressed white against the plastic. The hand looks like a promise folded. She does not think through the steps of law or rescue. Law is something officers do later. She lifts the child. The girl is smaller than she expects. Her skin is cool and the breath she draws is shallow and quick. Her lips are blue at the edges, not in a way that describes a crime but in a way that says a temperature has stolen warmth. Aunt Tiantian tucks the child against her chest, feels the broken doll head in a pocket press against the fabric. An element of the story she already understands. She says the child's name softly, as if speaking it will stitch her back together. Xinghe. Jingyi's eyes blink open like someone surfacing from a long joke. They hold a fog that she has learned to live inside of, and she says, small and immediate, "I was trying to help." The words are an anchor. They make sense to the woman who holds her. Aunt Tiantian moves without drama, wraps the child in her coat, and walks out the back door with a single bag of supplies. Tea, a knitted scarf, some dry crackers. She carries all that can deceive the house into thinking she has been for a short visit. She does not confront the parents. She does not tell them she has taken the child. She walks down the lane and into her own door like someone smuggling a remnant of daylight. She lays the child on a blanket by the stove, where the kettle will warm the air. The first thing she does is warm the girl's hands between her palms. Fingers are small and stubbornly cold, but they unfurl when compassionate heat is offered. She gives the child sips of warm tea and warm milk from a cup, holding her like a woman who knows how to keep secrets and hold their weight. "Don't say anything yet," she tells Xinghe, but the child does not hear it in the way adults mean. The child hears the tone and knits it into new safety. "Okay," she says, simple and quick. Her inner life is not yet full of calculation. It is full of trust and a childish hope that someone will do what must be done. For a day and a half, Aunt Tiantian does what neighbors do best and worst. She covers and she observes. She brings warm clothes, and she hums an old song until the child's breath slows. She takes the child to a small clinic under the pretense of, "Found a little one on my walk." An explanation that, in the gentle, bustling clinic, creates paperwork and color in a system that will later become official. The nurse takes the child's temperature and frowns in a way that adults later name concern, and the doctor, courteous, not sensational, makes a note, handing a leaflet about hypothermia and dehydration as documents that mediate between human fear and civil procedure. Aunt Tiantian speaks in factual phrases and makes the small decisions people often have time to make no matter what the consequences. She does not go to the police first, because she thinks of the mother, how a sudden, shame-cut voice might make her lash out, and because she knows that if she blames them publicly in that exact moment, the child's life could be tangled with a surge of defensiveness. She goes instead to a child protection hotline, to a social worker who works in the ordinary, slow bureaucratic rhythms of such cases. She answers questions with the cadence of someone who has planned this one act for a quiet, long while. I found her and I brought her to the clinic. She's safe now. When the call reaches the police, it arrives like an echo of what was already happening. The day the parents left the house for the hospital and the park, and the medicine cabinet appointments became a day without a child in it. Their leaving had been announced with a clumsy, frantic efficiency. A caravan of blankets and plastic bags, and an apologetic neighbor's couriering of items they thought they needed to calm the baby. They believed in the story they told themselves, that the older child had gotten into trouble and left, or that she had run away, or that she had been somewhere a child might be and would return. They could not imagine what they had done. On the street, gossip folds like old laundry. She's gone, someone says. She must have run away, another insists. Outrage and pity begin to balance in the community, each emotion giving the next an excuse to breathe. The father calls names, his voice dry. Xinghe, he says into the phone. He repeats the name until it is a chant. The mother collapses in a chair and cries in a way that is quiet and hot, as if each tear removes a layer of skin that had been calloused by small cruelties. The day tilts toward the public now. A neighbor with keys goes inside to look for the child, and then calls because the refrigerator door is shut and the kitchen is colder than it should be. A small search begins because the house has been left with an empty corner where a small bed used to be occupied. The police arrive and search. They find the kitchen, the bathroom, the closets, the laundry room, the cupboard, only to find the ordinary detritus of a busy household. At some point, a plain-suited detective, the kind with a notepad that reads more like ritual than revelation, stands with a flashlight and a magnifying patience. He opens and closes doors and makes notes. Nobody speaks about the fridge until the coroner is at the house and the mention of hypothermia appears in the news like a paper boat thrown into a pool. A preliminary coroner's statement, careful, factual, and later quoted by neighbors, mentions prolonged exposure to low temperature as a contributing factor in a child's near-fatal condition. The coroner's note is clinical. According to initial findings, the child exhibited signs consistent with severe hypothermia. The words land with the flatness of an official weight that turns misplaced decisions into legal facts. When the police call the parents to ask questions, the family is already unraveling. The father's face, which had been a map of anxious compassion, shrinks until every feature tightens into a single unpleasant expression. The mother rocks back and forth and thinks that confession will look like surrender. Their narratives, tinny and urgent, begin to leak. Friends and relatives appear at the door with casseroles and scolding. The grandmother quotes old proverbs and then, later, quotation marks around the phrase, "We must be accountable," as if those words were a neighborly chant. At Aunt Tiantian's house, the social worker arrives with a badge of paper and a steady voice. She sits across from the rescued child and asks gentle questions, her manner professional, her questions rehearsed. "What happened?" she asks, but asks it like someone who knows the answer might be too painful to simply deliver. The child repeats what she has always known to be true. "I wanted to cool my sister. I put my hand on her head." The sentence is not a defense, but a fact. Aunt Tiantian tells the social worker the timeline, what she knows, and what she had to see to be sure. The social worker takes notes and says the words that move the moment into institutions. "We will need to take statements. We will need to interview the parents. The police will be notified." Across the neighborhood, someone posts on a local message board, "Prayers for the family." Comments accumulate, some tender, some sharp. A few people, like Aunt Tiantian, hold the story in their hands and feel the weight of their choices. Others pick at the edges. "It's tragic," remarks one. "Where were the parents?" asks another, speaking with an assumption that only surfaces when a fault can be named and not felt. The mother receives a call at the hospital from the detective. Her voice becomes something made of silence and apology. She hears the words child protection and investigation, and something like a distant knock sounds against the hollow cage where her heart sits. She thinks, the world will know. The world will know that she, who had smoothed ruffles and hummed lullabies, had closed a small door on a small life in a moment of desperate fear. She goes home because the police ask her to answer questions. She sits in the kitchen, and the refrigerator stands like a closed fact between her and the rest of the house. The mother tries to write the event down. She writes and crosses out because the words are too heavy and the ink too small. Her guilt coats her like a second skin. Word spreads that the coroner is to make a preliminary report. In the courthouse-chambered tone of public announcements, people begin to whisper about responsibility and how a family could let such a thing happen. The grandmother, who had fed the narrative of necessary discipline for decades, feels her hands shake when she thinks of the way her own proverbs had been used to justify punishment. Her steady voice, a voice that once told children to be shy and proper, now trembles with the weight of the moral cost. She goes to the house and sits in a corner and does not say much. When she does speak, it is small, and it is for the first time to ask what she should have noticed. A funeral is planned in the hush that follows such tragedies, but not for the living. The family arranges a small ceremony of remorse, more for the town than for any body it contains. Candles will be lit and photographs placed on a table, and the community will attend and weep. The parents practice the words they will say, practicing the shape of contrition with a fear that their gestures will be seen as too small. Meanwhile, in the clinic, the child's cheeks begin to bloom again with color. She eats scrambled eggs and listens to another kind of adult conversation, one not about folklore or discipline, but about safety plans and temporary guardianship. The nurse says neutral things. "We are going to make sure you are safe, that you have warm blankets." And the child, who has been taught to rehearse her compliance, says, "Okay," and waits to see what safe will look like. There are moments when the rescued child looks at her reflection and traces the curve of her own cheek with small fingers, counting the ways warmth has returned. "I was cold," she says, because to name what happened is an act of reclamation. "But now I am warm." The social worker arranges a meeting at a small municipal office where a woman with kind, efficient hair asks the parents to come and sit and answer questions. The mother arrives first, hair wet from recent washing, eyes red. The father comes with his face set, and a silence that acts like armor. They sit across from officials who write either sympathetically or unblinkingly, depending on the taste of the person who has been given the desk that day. The grandmother sits with a handkerchief and a face that seems to shed apologies one small fold at a time. Aunt Tiantian attends the meeting too, with the child at her side. The room becomes a place where personal history meets civil procedure, and both are awkward. The social worker asks the mother about the night in the refrigerator, and the mother's voice, when it comes, is a fracture. Her eyes are large with a flood of shame. She speaks haltingly. She describes fear, exhaustion, fever, the urge to teach a lesson that would be remembered. She describes telling the older child to stay put and to understand consequences. Her voice becomes a map of regret. "I thought she would come out," she says. "I thought it was for her good." The father's confession arrives with a different shape. He speaks of his silence, of his choices to look away. He speaks of how work had become the shield he could give, and the therapy he could not afford. He says, "I didn't know." But the sentence does not finish itself into absolution. It hangs in the room like a question every neighbor could not answer for them. The council's representative, formal and steady, says things that the family hears as possibility and threat. They will evaluate guardianship. They will consider temporary placement. They will review the family's ability to provide a safe environment. These words have the gravity of a slow-moving storm. The mother's shoulders fold in the way of someone who is used to carrying invisible loads and is now being asked to return something heavier than the one she expected. The news of the case moves faster than the family can reconcile. Reporters who had first speculated on the parent's absence or a child's running away shift tone overnight when Aunt Tiantian volunteers her account and when the social worker confirms that the child had been rescued. The coroner's report, while clinical, has a way of being read like a sentence. According to the coroner's preliminary findings, the child suffered severe exposure to low temperature. The line is repeated in town with the pattern of someone reading from a menu. People stitch the words into their gossip, and in the market, and on buses, and in the office. Public shame arrives like a late guest. The mother answers the reporter's question with shaking hands, and the father's face contorts when a neighbor spits accusations, as if the way to feel safe was to assign blame loudly. The grandmother, who had helped smooth the fabric of household norms, finds her own hand turned against herself when acquaintances ask her how she could have allowed such reasoning to take hold. "We meant discipline," she says to anyone who will listen, "but we did not mean this." There is a confrontation that plays out like an old drama when the social worker sits the parents down and lays out the options they face. Counseling, temporary removal, possibility of legal proceedings. The words are practical and terrible, like arithmetic that measures trust. The mother cries in the presence of officials and confesses, not for legal absolution, but for the bone-deep relief that comes when a truth is told. She tells the story of the dial and the doll and the day she broke plastic as if she is cataloging crimes that anyone could understand. Her voice is small and painful when she finishes and asks, "What do I do now?" What she does now is both smaller and larger than any apology. She says in a line that will be spoken later with variations, "I didn't mean to hurt her." It is not a defense. It is a woman trying to be honest in a world that requires bravery more than words. Aunt Tiantian, whose actions had begun as instinct, now becomes deliberate. She does not want to escalate the spectacle beyond what is necessary for the child's safety. She also wants the truth to be known. She brings the child to a public meeting where the police and social services are present. She sits and watches as the family's responses are gathered. There is a moment where the child is brought forward, small, clothed in a scarf that smells of rice and boiled herbs. And the parents see her again not as a rumor, but as a person who had almost been lost. The sight of their daughter, alive and warm, reconfigures the room. The father cannot stop himself from stepping forward, but the social worker says gently, "We need to maintain boundaries here." The mother collapses into a chair and weeps like someone who has been given a second life by an act she cannot undo. Regret spills out in the form of confession, and then in red hands, reaching toward a child who has been pulled from one life and placed under someone else's care. When the mother speaks directly to the child, the words are awkward with love and fear. "I am sorry," she says, and the child, who has been trained to reply with compliance, gives back a short, flat, almost robotically polite, "Okay." But inside, the child decides something that neither the social worker nor the coroner can legislate. She decides whether there is room in her small chest for what the parents offer now. A public hearing, less formal than a courtroom but no less heavy, becomes the place where accountability and mercy meet. The mother confesses to the social worker and the police. She admits the act of locking the refrigerator. She says the words, and they change the air in the room from speculation to confession. The officers take notes, but the real torque of change comes from the way the neighbors who had once defended the mother now look away, and the way that those who had judged before now feel the pinch of silence where judgment lived. The father collapses into his hands and weeps, but the mother's confession is not a healing balm. The law takes its course through interviews, statements, and provisional orders. The social worker is clear. The child will not be returned to the home until an evaluation of safety is complete. That is the kind of decision that looks simple, but is layered with consequence. It is a line drawn to prevent harm, while leaving the family's future uncertain. Outside the room, neighbors gather and speak in tones that have the sound of finality. "They picked the baby," one man says. "They thought the little one was more important." It is a thread of truth that will not peel easily away. The community that had once enabled the small acts of favoritism now finds itself having to reckon with the institutions that intervene when private choices become dangerous. In the quiet that follows, Aunt Tiantian becomes the kind of guardian the child needs in those early days. Patient, steady, and willing to answer questions that are not easy. She tells stories of her own youth, of small humiliations turned into lessons. She speaks at low volume about what it means to be seen. She stitches the doll's head back onto its body with a hot glue tack that is less important than the ceremony she performs. Once the doll is fixed, the child watches, and the act of repair becomes a sermon in itself. Family, Aunt Tiantian tells the girl once, while tucking a blanket higher, is the people who keep you warm, not always the ones with your name on the papers. The phrase lands soft and true. There are other salvations. The neighbor who had once spouted gossip now offers to bring over warm soups and sits in the doorway listening without giving advice. The grandmother goes silent for days, and then one morning arrives with a small box. Inside, the frilly dress the baby had been wearing in photographs. No longer a weapon, but an item of regret turned into offering. She says nothing when she hands it across the table, but the act acknowledges a change. She is beginning to see that the stories she told to rationalize favoritism had consequences. As the investigations deepen, the police conduct formal interviews. They ask about the sequence of events and about the reasons for the punishment. The mother's answers, sharply honest and gutted with remorse, become the key evidence the police add to their file. The coroner's office provides their report in measured language. Exposure to low environmental temperature was a major factor in the child's condition. The words are repeated in official memos and stored in files that are called case records. The family reads them, and the paper has the texture of both accusation and possibility. The community's anger and sympathy are mixed. Some people petition for custody to be removed entirely. Others argue that parents can repent given counseling and time. The social worker arranges for counseling to begin, for the mother and father to have sessions where they can speak and attempt, under professional supervision, to unfold how fear became a punishment. The sessions are filmed in memory as small, quiet exchanges where the mother says, "I was scared," and where the father says, "I was tired." Neither sentence excuses the deed, but both are part of the honest fabric of human failure. One morning, after the initial crisis has been stabilized and the child's cheeks are warm enough to pinch, the social worker brings a small formal document that outlines the options. Temporary guardianship with Aunt Tiantian, a period of monitored reunification if certain conditions are met, or a longer legal process if the parents cannot meet the standard of safety. It is a set of choices wrapped in institutional language. To the parents, it looks like a map of a route back into the life they have lost. To the child, it reads differently. It is a list of places she might be. It is in that exact moment she surprises everyone and chooses. She chooses not with legal phrasing, but with the blunt, honest logic of a child who has been measured and recalibrated. "I want to stay with Aunt Tiantian," she says when asked. The sentence is short, and it lands with the force of a decision made in a room full of adults who had only grudgingly begun to see the child as an author of her own life. The mother's face drains of color. The father's hands tremble. The social worker writes the sentence down as if it were a note, but it is more than that. It is the pivot point that will direct the next months. The reasons for the child's choice are simple and impossible to reduce. Smiled faces at Aunt Tiantian's house, warm broth that did not come with explanations or lessons, a hand held with steady confidence rather than fear. The child had thought, deep inside, that family must be where one is kept safe. When asked to choose, she chooses the person who had risked safety to protect her, who had warmed her and then involved the necessary authorities, so the act would also be accountable. The parents react in ways that are raw and human. The father tries to argue, too late, that he will change, that he can make their home safe. The mother pleads with the child with words of apology and promises once rehearsed. She brings small gifts, not to buy consent, but to express regret, clumsy in the way only those who hurt can be. "I will do anything," she says, and in the smallness of the sentence is a hope that cannot be a right. The child listens, but the child's choice is intact. There is a hearing, not a sensational televised story, but a formal session in a municipal office where decisions about custody have a bureaucratic texture. The social worker recommends temporary guardianship with Aunt Tiantian, citing the child's expressed preference, the guardian's capacity to care, and the need for the child to recover in a place unmarked by the scenes that led to the event. The official language is both blunt and protective. We recommend a temporary placement for the child in question, pending further safety evaluations. The parents hear this, and the mother collapses into a chair and cries the way guilt often surfaces, raw, pleading, incomplete. The father does not hold the child the way he wants to. When he reaches out to touch her shoulder in the meeting, the social worker stops him and says in private, "Let the child set the pace." The line is not meant to punish but to protect, to give agency to a child who had been deprived of it. The father lowers his hand like a man who has been taught a lesson without the luxury of time. After the hearing, the child returns to Aunt Tiantian's home and sleeps in a small bed that Aunt had set up with a ribbon on the pillow and a small new doll that looks like the one that had been broken, but is, in some quiet way, more whole because the pieces have been mended and the seams are visible. Small rituals of repair matter. Aunt Tiantian teaches her new songs, reads stories about brave girls who are also kind, and in the mornings brings porridge that tastes of cinnamon and familiarity. The child learns to speak the name of her fear, and occasionally to laugh at a joke again. The mother goes through sessions with a counselor, and does what she can to repair the scaffold that allowed such favoritism to calcify into cruelty. She attends meetings where they teach parents how to manage fear without giving in to punitive impulses. She volunteers for community groups and speaks, in meetings that are closed but earnest, about how traditions of discipline have been twisted into something dangerous. She's a small part of the solution group, and sometimes the room looks at her with suspicion and sometimes with gratitude that she shows up. There are no quick absolutions. Her apologies remain open-ended. They are the work of someone who understands that words without actions die quick and bitter. The father returns to his attempts at presence. He waits sometimes outside Aunt Tiantian's doorway, because he has learned he cannot simply barge in with promises. He shows up with practical help, fixing a leaking tap, offering to take the child to school when the guardianship requires supervised visits. His remorse is more visible in labor than in rhetoric. "I will be here when you need me," he murmurs, in moments when the child allows him near. The child tolerates him in increments, like the way one tests a hot stove with a fingertip. Neighbors who had once whispered about the mother now speak of the family with more complexity. "We didn't see it," one woman admits to Aunt Tiantian over tea, and the words are more honest than weeping. "We preferred easy answers." The acknowledgement is small, but it is one of the ways communities can change, by ceasing to invent tidy narratives that shield them from guilt. There are legal threads that run quietly through the months after the rescue. Meetings, forms, and reviews happen. The social worker files reports. The police close certain parts of the inquiry because of the mother's confession, and the focus shifts to rehabilitation. The community organizes a small support group, where families can talk about discipline and favoritism. The police sometimes attend to hear how local culture shapes choices. It is ordinary work, tedious, sometimes bureaucratic, but it moves the needle in the small ways that matter. Over time, the child's scars become less visible to the eye and more visible to memory. She is better at sleep and worse at being startled by loud noises in the kitchen. She draws family pictures now, with Aunt Tiantian at the center, sometimes filling in the space at the corner with a tiny representation of the parents whose faces are less clear. When asked why the parents are small in her pictures, she answers, "They're learning." The sentence is the kind of hope that acknowledges learning is long and uncertain. There are symbolic gestures that move the narrative toward the shape of repair. The father returns a necklace, a small token of the baby's early days, to the mother with a note of apology and a promise to attend therapy. The grandmother takes an evening walk itself and buys a small slipper for the rescued child. She brings it to Aunt Tiantian's with a bowl of soup and the unspoken recognition that the old proverbs must be softened. The community organizes a fund to help cover therapy for the child and other families who cannot afford it, an act that is practical and sincere, though never quite enough to erase what was done. Months pass, and the official part of the story concludes with a plan. The child remains under Aunt Tiantian's guardianship, while the parents undergo monitoring and therapy with the possibility, in the far distance, of carefully supervised visits. The language the officials use is cautious, They do not promise reunification as a right, and they do not paint the future in a single color. Instead, they map a path that is chosen not by sentiment but by safety, where the child's preference and well-being are the primary compass. On the day the papers are signed, the child tucks a small drawing into Aunt Tiantian's pocket. A picture of the two of them with a sun above and a red door between their homes. She hands it with the gravity of a small diplomat offering a treaty. "Thank you," she says, civilized and clear. The words are not for spectacle. They are for the person who made her warm, and who made the hard choice to make the rescue public in a way that ensured consequences. There are no fairy tale endings. The parents continue to live with the memory of what they did. They attend sessions, write letters of apology that are sometimes given to the child through proper channels, and try to become people fit for the privilege of parenting. The mother sometimes sits in a park and watches other children, learning anew how to be attentive without giving in to fear. The father learns to listen and to be present not as a performance but as a steadying weight. The child learns to trust carefully. She learns that people can change, and that some things never go back to the way they were. There are moments of tenderness, the mother quietly leaving a bowl of fruit at Aunt Tiantian's door, and moments of tension, the child flinching when a refrigerator door slams at Aunt's house during a storm. Healing is a series of small transactions. It is not a single act, but a many-layered sequence of repairs, apologies, and petitions for grace. In public, the family becomes a cautionary tale and a model for what happens when communities choose awareness over indifference. People in the neighborhood begin to speak out against silent favoritism and parental excuses. They form a small committee to advise on child safety in local schools and clinics. The grandmother becomes a volunteer in a parenting class. The mother, an intermittent speaker, on the difficulty of balancing fear and care. Their work feels like penance and also like a contribution, and sometimes those two things are the same. Years later, at a small ceremony, the child, older by a handful of years but carrying the same startling honesty, places a ribbon on a tiny memory box. Inside are the repaired doll, a photograph of her with Aunt Tiantian in a bright park, a drawing of a house with many windows. She looks at the box and sets it on a shelf where she can see it from her bed. The house that once had a refrigerator that swallowed a child is now a place with a different contour. Windows mended, doors with keys kept where children can see them, neighbors who no longer pretend not to see. In the quiet of that evening, the child traces the edge of the pillow that Aunt Tiantian has stitched with a tiny key stitched into the fabric, a symbolic key, never used to lock, but to remind. She breathes out and feels the warm air of the room on her face the way she used to feel the cold inside the small white box. "I am here," she says, not as a plea but as a statement of fact. It is a sentence she has practiced and learned to mean in new ways. The mother and father learn, painfully, that regret is an ongoing practice, not a one-off confession. They try to rebuild a relationship that is honest and accountable, not entitled. They learn to give things without expecting forgiveness in return, and sometimes, in small and careful increments, the child responds with gestures that are not full pardon, but are real forms of recognition. A wave across a courtyard, a note in a school notebook, a supervised visit where the child chooses how long she will stay. What remains is this: a community that has been forced to look, to name complicity, and to act. A guardian who risked the very relationships she valued to save a child, because saving her was more important than neighborly peace. Parents who now live with the consequences and attempt to turn their remorse into a roadmap for better days. And a child who learns in hard and honest steps that being chosen is not the same as being loved, and that chosen family can be a shelter that helps rebuild what was broken. On a late afternoon, the child walks with Aunt Tiantian back to the gate of the house where she was nearly lost. She stands on the threshold and looks at the door they once used to think was safe, the refrigerator door in her memory like a painted scene. She places her small palm against the gate and feels its coolness, and then she turns and walks back. Behind her, a small key sewn into her pillowcase glints faintly, not as a tool but as testimony. There was a lock, and there was a person who found a way to open the room of the world for her again. They had chosen the baby once, and in that choice had broken something true. But the work of repair, messy, slow, accountable, had given her a new kind of family and a voice that would one day speak for other small ones who had no voice. The parents lived with the learning, the community lived with memory, and the child carried forward with a stubborn and honest capacity to say what she needed. I want to stay safe. That sentence, offered without anger and without erasing the past, proved to be the most decisive thing in the end. If you believe children deserve to be seen and protected, please consider sharing this story and supporting efforts that keep kids safe. The last image is not a triumphal one. It is a small domestic one. The repaired doll on a shelf, a plate of warm food left by the grandmother, the sound of water boiling for tea. The child sleeps with her hand curled around a soft blanket, no longer small enough to be swallowed by the dark, and the house finally breathes with a steadier rhythm. The key sewn into the pillow remains a symbol, a reminder of what was lost and what was saved, and a promise that while nothing can fully erase harm, accountability, chosen love, and steady care can create a life where the next morning is warmer than the last. If this story mattered to you, share it with someone who should know about the quiet dangers of favoritism, the cost of silence, and the power of one person's courage to change a life.